Hey guys, it's January, so I am just doing great. You know, who has ever said that January is the best month? That's some psychopath shit. Although who has conversations about what's the best month? That's also a little bit odd, I guess. Even though the answer would be October, of course. But today we're gonna be talking about Better Man, a movie that is really sweeping people off their feet, and Den of Thieves 2 Pantera, a movie that is not doing that. But oddly enough, both movies impressed me just in very different ways and at very different scales. Den of Thieves 2 Pantera is the sequel to Den of Thieves, a movie that no one aside from maybe your uncle talks about. I actually had not seen the first film until the night before I went to go see the second, and so within the weekend, I kind of became a scholar on Den of Thieves. And my academic diagnosis is that the first film is, it's not very good. It's clearly a play on Heat, a movie that is just too good.
She got a great ass!
I mean, yeah, Heat can be a little bit dumb sometimes, but at other times, it's, I don't know, the best thing ever. The difference between Heat and Den of Thieves is that, number one, you care about the characters in Heat, and number two, the filmmaking is just clearly not as strong in Den of Thieves. The first Den of Thieves is a great example of inspiration going nowhere. Sure, it has inspiration, so, you know, it did that part right, but it certainly lacks originality and doesn't even take the right lessons from Heat. Den of Thieves is Heat minus the class. It's a movie about a bunch of pretty garbage people who I think the movie would like to think of as realistic, but instead they're cliche and awfully inhuman. The macho stylings of Den of Thieves is really laid on thick and results in a pretty boring, repetitive movie. And Den of Thieves 2 also falls into some of those traps, but also I think surprisingly rises above some of them. So this one follows O'Shea Jackson Jr. from the first movie planning a heist, but now with Gerard Butler's character, who is a cop, but now isn't because, you know, he's sad and shit. The first 45 minutes of this movie are actually terrible. It is filled with clunky exposition and bad dialogue that could just be simpled down to a bunch of characters just saying the F word, and I couldn't stand it. There's a scene in this movie in which Gerard Butler talks to a stripper from the first film, and I could have sworn that a high schooler wrote it. But then all of a sudden, this movie actually slows down and lets its characters talk to each other with genuine purpose. There are a couple scenes where it's just O'Shea Jackson Jr. and Gerard Butler talking about why their life went the way it went, and just in those couple of scenes, I learned more about these characters than anything in the first movie. I'm not saying that like these scenes are perfect, but there is a monologue that O'Shea Jackson Jr. gives about how he got into robbing places, and it was actually kind of striking. And there's really only a couple scenes like this, but the fact that this movie did it was awfully refreshing and affirmed to me that maybe this franchise has a little bit more care in it than I initially thought it did. And just the little improvements in the character writing made me enjoy the heist a whole lot more, because the first Den of Thieves does have a pretty good heist in the third act, even though it devolves into a pretty sloppy gunfight. And this movie somewhat acts the same way, but because of that little extra bump in the performances and writing, I didn't feel like things were as tedious. The interesting part though is that even though the character writing has improved, the plot writing is still as convoluted as ever, maybe even more so. Because think about it, the first Den of Thieves is pretty sloppy and it's just two competing parties, right? You have the bank robbers and the police, but in this movie, there's four. And this definitely makes things kind of incomprehensible at times, but also at other points kind of insanely obvious. But luckily, the bromance wrappings of this movie are enough to latch onto, even though the plot is, you know, you might not know what's happening, because this is a heist movie where I didn't know when the heist was actually about to begin. There doesn't seem to be a proper build up to events in that aspect, but as soon as the heist starts, I was in it. This is a bit of a video game heist, but then it breaks out into a car chase shootout, and I was taken with it. And I think that's what most audiences are going for, and if you look at it, Pantera is getting better scores across the board than the original one, and I'm inclined to agree. The one element that I did miss with Pantera from the first film is the idea of a Den of Thieves. So in the first one, O'Shea Jackson Jr. works at this bar, and at this bar, he's able to come across like a bunch of criminals and cops and people who work in different places, and through working in this place, you know, through meeting all these people, that's how he's able to orchestrate the heist. It was a good use of location and highlighted the albeit limited themes, but you know, it did highlight the themes. And Den of Thieves 2 Pantera is just another heist movie with, yeah, competing parties. So obviously it lives up to the title, right? Like, it is a movie about thieves, but it's not necessarily about the Den of Thieves like the first one was. Because yeah, I thought that bar idea was pretty good, and you know, that's just one idea from the first movie though that I thought was lacking, because other than that, I thought that this one was much more improved. Pantera was surprisingly a more investing movie that played its conventional cards conventionally, but I thought it worked. I think I would be okay with getting another one of these. Now that this series of films has centered on exactly what the relationship between its two main characters is, I think this could go places. Not many places, but, you know, places. So I'm gonna give Den of Thieves 2 Pantera a 6 out of 10. Better Man is a movie that is surprisingly blowing a lot of people away, and in many ways, I agree. There are a couple sequences in this movie that impressed the hell out of me and kind of made for some of the most memorable movie moments in a while. I did not expect this, because this is a music biopic about the life of British pop star Robbie Williams, and it does play out like most of its genre forebears, but it's also a batshit musical, and in the film, he is portrayed as a monkey. It is quite the choice, and I think this movie's detractors would say that the monkey aspect is kind of a gimmick, but I really don't think so. I mean, maybe with the conception of this film, it was a little bit of a gimmick, but by the end, I think it was there, and I think it was actually pretty smart. And you know, we're always looking for music biopics to do something different, and this was something different. So even if this choice didn't necessarily work for you, I think that it still has some merit that isn't usually attached to this genre. Now, I don't think that this is the first of its kind. I mean, I think the Rocket Man influences are pretty clear when you're watching this, and I think Rocket Man is just a better executed movie. It's a little bit more focused, and on a personal level, I just prefer the music. But the fact that this movie did remind me of Rocket Man just goes to show that the inspiration is coming from the right place. But it's not just a visual one-for-one. Michael Gracie, the director of The Greatest Showman, saw that Rocket Man kind of opened up the genre, and then he opened it up even more. Some of the transitions are actually incredible, and there are sequences that can only be described as electric. The filmmaking here is actually pretty comparative to movies like Boogie Nights and Babylon, just with quite a bit more CGI. But the fact that I was thinking of Boogie Nights and Babylon while watching Better Man, that's pretty cool. And I would actually say that there is one 5-minute dance sequence that is the best since Steven Spielberg's West Side Story. And this surprised me because I really didn't have a whole lot of knowledge about Robbie Williams going into the movie. In fact, whenever I first saw the trailer like 4 months ago or whatever, and then Robbie Williams says, "I'm one of the biggest pop stars in the world," I wasn't sure if I believed him. And you might say that I'm an ignorant American, and yeah, that's true. But it's not like I know a whole lot about American pop stars either. I just learned that Ice Spice wasn't one of the Spice Girls. So you know, that's where I'm at. And so walking into this movie, I didn't really have much of an opinion on Robbie Williams, but I did go see this movie at the Alamo. And you know how at the Alamo, like, they show you things related to the film before the movie starts? Well, with this, it was just a bunch of music videos that Robbie Williams had obviously done. And I must say that I kind of hated them. I thought the music was bad. I was actually surprised. I was like, how is this guy a big pop star? But then again, with any pop star, I'm usually questioning why they're so popular. But either way, it wasn't a great introduction to Robbie Williams, but then whenever these same songs show up in the movie, I was digging it. The mix was excellent, and some of the added instrumentation was awesome. I didn't technically like every single song, but most of them were pretty effective and folded into the narrative quite well. And tagged along things that I just didn't know about Robbie Williams. I did not know that he was in a boy band, because there's a pretty big portion of this film that is dedicated to criticisms of the internal and external culture of boy bands. And I did find this to be one of the more interesting ideas in the movie, and it really did clue me in to how ruthlessly critical this film is. Better Man is not a happy movie. This is a movie that is very much interested in beating you down with lines of cocaine and questionable actions by very questionable people. And this is very purposeful. So in many ways, it's kind of hard to critique it. Like, what are you supposed to say? The movie was like too harsh, because if that's what his life was, then that's what his life was. But this harshness made it so that I'm not sure this film was entirely balanced in its ideas. Because this movie leans so much into these high emotions of depression and excess with barely a moment to breathe, it comes off as slightly fake despite dealing with very real concepts. Which leads to one of the greater pieces of discourse when it comes to biopics, specifically music biopics, whenever the subject of them is so heavily tied to the making of it. And it's the idea of Better Man being a therapy session for Robbie Williams more than anything else. And the people who don't seem to enjoy this movie, that does look to be like their biggest concern with it. And I do kind of agree. I mean, therapy is certainly a heavy aspect of this film, but unlike that sounds to some people, I don't always think that that's a negative. Because while yes, sometimes this idea of therapy results in some of the negatives of the film, it also opens the door to some really strong observations and lines of dialogue that could really only be produced from someone who's lived this life. I think whenever this movie movie is zoning in on criticisms of pop culture and fan culture and how we treat celebrity as a concept, it's pretty biting. The thing is that because we're always looking at it from the perspective of Robbie Williams and lines are barely blurred, some elements of the movie do seem to be slightly uneven. This movie would have you believe that in his life, the only people that were nice to him were his flatly written mother, grandmother, romantic interest, and best friend. The good parts of Robbie Williams' life seem to be kind of on the back burner with this one, because it feels like everything else in this movie is a villain. The boy band, his manager, maybe not the fans, but fan culture, and even though the movie puts a bow on it, his father is consistently an awful force in his life. The movie can feel like he's playing the blame game, which, yeah, sometimes is warranted, but other times, to me, not as much. And if you see that route of storytelling is somewhat self-serving, given the fact that Robbie Williams was heavily tied to the making of this movie, I can't really argue with that. But at the same time, Better Man does reach some pretty powerful conclusions about Williams' life that I think are worth sharing, especially in this high affect way. Even though I would say that this movie deals with two pretty big ideas about his life, and one of them is dealt with very well and not so much the other. But to talk about these ideas, I will have to get into spoilers. I would not have expected the Better Man review to have a spoiler section, but here we are. Both of the big ideas in this movie are about forgiveness, because with forgiveness, there's always two sides, right? You have forgiveness of the self and forgiveness of others. And I think this idea of Robbie Williams forgiving himself and loving himself is done really well here. Throughout, there is a motif of Robbie seeing the younger versions of himself in the audience whenever he's performing, and this obviously trips him up. Whenever he sees himself, it's a reminder of his trauma and kind of his lost innocence. And it works. It's a really visually cool concept and is capitalized on with one of the most wild scenes in a wide release movie in a while. Because near the end of this movie, there's this huge concert, and in it, Robbie Williams, he sees a bunch of himself in the audience, and so he just jumps into the crowd, and then he starts fighting everyone. And it's not just like him punching himself, it's him full force stabbing. It's like this huge riot, it's this fantasy action scene, and it culminates with him metaphorically killing his younger self. Like he stabs his younger self. That is in this movie. And it's kind of funny, but also incredibly emotionally effective. Like even as an action scene, it's just great cinema. And as far as the movie just really pushing itself and displaying its ideas creatively, this is that. And because the scene is so good, whenever you get to the end and he looks at the previous versions of himself in the audience and he looks at them with love, it's pretty affecting. I'm not sure the arc was perfectly smooth in terms of him going from hate to love, but either way, I thought the climaxes were pretty effective. So as far as self-love goes, I think this movie did it really well, and I'm quite happy for Robbie Williams that he was able to do that. So good on you, Robbie. But now I'm gonna disagree with you, because I don't think this movie handles his relationship with his father very well, to the point where whenever I got to the end, it kind of left a bad taste in my mouth. And I don't know, maybe I missed something, because clearly people are getting a lot out of this movie, and especially this ending, but I thought the movie just kind of fell over itself with its last lines of dialogue. So throughout the movie, Robbie's relationship with his dad is strained because his father implanted ideas of worth being based on fame and riches, built off of the idea of you making something of yourself by having, in quotes, it. I don't really think it takes a psychologist to realize that this type of rhetoric is just, it's not good for the growth of a child. It could really only lead to ideas of self-hate and poor ways of treating yourself and others. And this movie shows that ideology has messed his father up just as much as it's messed him up. And so whenever you get to the end and Robbie Williams is at this huge concert and he invites his dad up to the stage to sing a final song, it kind of is this ultimate olive branch of love, and I was like, wow, this is pretty sweet. This should have been a really exceptional moment of two people realizing where they've come from and how much they've grown. But instead, the father goes up there and he says to his son that he's proud of him and, in quotes, "You're a god." And I think that this just doesn't work for me, because it's reinforcing ideas that I thought that Robbie and his father had grown past. This type of toxic ambition is exactly what put these two people in the places where they were trying to get out of. And let's be real, no true happy ending ends with someone being a god. Obviously, Robbie Williams has not read Dune. And I think that Better Man ending with an unabashed note of praise for Robbie Williams kind of just undercuts what the movie was initially getting at. I thought the arc of Robbie Williams was going to be him loving himself and realizing that he doesn't need praise or attention from others, but the movie doesn't end that way. And so with a movie that focuses so heavily on the descent of this one character to then just rush past the ascent, it was kind of odd. And then the final line of the movie is him saying to the audience, "Go fuck yourself." And this is totally done in a tongue-in-cheek way, so, you know, I don't want to be like entirely too critical of it. But in this context, it's a movie about one arc. It's this one guy growing to be better. And so to immediately just have him regress into his outdated persona, it was kind of confusing. I would love to say if Better Man was a film that is someone truthfully reflecting on their lives, and in some ways it does read that way. But just as many moments come off as quite half-assed and unexamined, which just doesn't work given how it tries to reach this super uplifting ending. So even though I was entirely impressed with the craft of this movie, whenever I look at the ending, I kind of look back at the whole thing as a bit of a negative experience. Better Man is a movie that hits you over the head with only the boldest emotions, and sometimes it creates an awfully confusing effect that makes you question its somewhat muddled intentions, while other times it creates an experience that is unforgettable and powerful. I really wish that I could give Better Man a 7.5 out of 10, but I just don't think that I can. Sitting at 2 hours and 15 minutes, I just don't think that I'll be returning to this one. Although I might be searching up a couple scenes on YouTube. So I'm gonna give Better Man a 7 out of 10. And I am quite saddened by its performance in the States. I wish this movie was doing better because it genuinely is a very neat movie. I will say that with this and Emilia Perez, it kind of seems to be the year of rated R musicals. And with that, I do think that Better Man is, better. But, enough about this movie. Please be nice in the comments if you're just some British person who's like, you don't understand Robbie Williams. Maybe that's true. I don't know. But seriously, tell me if you agree or disagree. I am cool with either one. And honestly, there are just so many worse studio movies coming out nowadays, so go see Better Man. It's kind of odd and kind of fun and kind of sad. It's kind of a lot of things. So Better Man, more like better than I thought it'd be.